Since 2014, Ukraine and Russia have been embroiled in the Crimea crisis. Russia seized Crimea, a territory that had belonged to Ukraine. Subsequently, pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine rose up in rebellion. With Russian support, they quickly seized control of the Donbas region in the southeast through military force. This led to full-scale fighting between Ukrainian government troops and the pro-Russian separatists, plunging the two countries into a state of open hostility. Over the following 8 years, the war ebbed and flowed in intensity, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties. This prolonged conflict became known as the Donbas War. By 2021, tensions escalated once again. Russia amassed around 100,000 troops along the Ukrainian border, while the United States largely stood by without significant intervention. The possibility of a full Russian invasion of Ukraine loomed large. The deep-seated animosity between Ukraine and Russia traces back to the Middle Ages.
Although the two nations share common ancestors, they diverged onto markedly different paths, developing distinct languages and cultures. So, what exactly lies at the heart of their profound enmity? To understand this, we must delve into the history of Ukraine. The rise of Kievan Rus in the Viking Age. In the 9th century, during the era of the Vikings, Norse seafarers from Scandinavia expanded outward, establishing control over vast territories. The ruling elite consisted of Viking nobles, while the lower strata of society were primarily East Slavs. Over several centuries of intermingling and assimilation, the Viking aristocracy gradually Slavicized. After the 9th century, centered around Kiev, the current capital of Ukraine, the East Slavs established their first major state, Kievan Rus. Before the Age of Discovery, the world's premier trade hub was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Renowned Venetian merchants grew immensely wealthy through Eastern trade. For Vikings from Northern Europe seeking to conduct business in Constantinople, the most practical route avoided the lengthy detour via the North Sea and Mediterranean. Instead, they navigated inland rivers across Europe, reaching the Black Sea and eventually arriving at the prosperous Byzantine capital. Controlling the Dnieper River and the vital waterways leading to the Black Sea made Kiev a crucial hub. Additionally, Kievan Rus forged dynastic ties through marriages with Byzantine princesses and adopted Eastern Orthodoxy as its state religion. Economically and culturally, Kievan Rus flourished. Its territory encompassed much of present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and southern regions of modern Russia. This Kievan Rus serves as the common ancestral state for the three modern East Slavic nations, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Fragmentation and divergent paths in the 12th century. By the 12th century, Kievan Rus descended into endless internal strife and external threats, eventually fragmenting into numerous smaller principalities.
Residents near Kiev migrated in two main directions for safety: westward to the more secure region of Galicia and eastward toward the upper reaches of the Volga River. These migrations laid the foundations for distinct polities. The western branch evolved into the Ukrainian people, while the eastern one developed into the Russians. From this point onward, these sibling peoples with shared origins embarked on separate trajectories, setting the stage for centuries of grievances and rivalry. Today, the name Rus, the ancestral banner, has been most prominently claimed by the strongest successor, Russia. In Russian, the words for Russia and Rus are essentially the same. In Chinese translation, distinctions were made for clarity. However, when examining historical continuity, cultural inheritance, and geographic centrality, Ukraine can be seen as the more direct heir to the Kievan Rus legacy. Mongol invasion and the rise of Muscovy. In the 13th century, Mongol hordes swept across Eurasia. Under Batu Khan, they captured Kiev, devastating Kievan Rus. Many princes and nobles perished or fled. The Mongol invasion accelerated the division of the East Slavs into three distinct nations: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Russians managed to avoid total subjugation through substantial tribute and bribes, becoming vassals of the Mongols. Soon after, the Golden Horde was established. Russians served as tax collectors for the Mongols, gradually strengthening their position under this overlordship. By 1480, as the Golden Horde weakened, the Russians expelled them from Central Asia and Eastern Europe. They unified the northeastern territories of the former Kievan Rus, establishing the Grand Duchy of Moscow. This became the foundation of what would later emerge as the Russian state. In contrast, Ukraine sought assistance from the rising power of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Through a series of marriages and alliances, Ukraine came under Polish-Lithuanian rule. Religiously, Ukrainians were pressured to adopt Catholicism. In western Ukraine, a compromise emerged with the Union of Brest, creating the Uniate, or Greek Catholic Church, which retained many Eastern Orthodox rituals while acknowledging papal authority. Eastern Ukraine, however, remained steadfastly Orthodox. From the 17th century onward, Eastern Ukrainians launched repeated uprisings. The Cossacks, who established the Cossack Hetmanate, formed the backbone of these resistance forces. At the time, the Cossacks faced formidable neighbors. To the west, the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at its peak. To the east, the rapidly expanding Tsardom of Russia, and to the south, the mighty Ottoman Empire, which spanned 3 continents. Ultimately, the Cossacks turned to their long-lost Orthodox brethren, the Russians, with whom they shared closer cultural and religious ties. In 1654, they signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav, joining the Tsardom of Russia. Russia honored the alliance by immediately deploying troops and engaging in a grueling 13-year war against Poland. Victorious, Russia signed the Treaty of Andrusovo, which partitioned Ukraine. Russia gained control of eastern Ukraine, while Poland retained western Ukraine. The Black Sea coast, including Crimea, remained under Ottoman Turkish control. Russia viewed its heavy involvement as an effort to restore the integrity of the ancestral Rus lands. Ukrainians, however, saw the relationship as a temporary alliance against common foes, Poland and Turkey, and opposed full incorporation. When Poland later attempted reconciliation with eastern Ukraine, offering equal political status, autonomy in economic, military, and religious affairs, Russia responded by invading, stripping eastern Ukraine of its autonomy and reducing it to a subordinate entity. Centuries of integration and tension. Over the subsequent 300 years, Russia aggressively promoted Russian culture and values in eastern Ukraine, leading to gradual assimilation into the Russian Empire. This deepened the cultural divide with western Ukraine. In the late 18th century, the once mighty Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth declined. Surrounded by powerful neighbors, Russia, Austria, and the rising Prussia, it was partitioned 3 times. This brought western Ukraine under Russian control, reuniting much of the former Kievan Rus territory under Slavic rule. However, the westernmost region of Galicia only joined in 1939 and maintained relatively weak ties to Russia. Ukraine's strategic geography, guarding Russia's southwestern flank and access to the Black Sea, made it indispensable. Russia never relinquished its claims. Many Russians viewed Ukrainians as essentially the same people, separated only by the Mongol disruptions of the 13th century. With Russia's rise, the narrative held that the little brother should return to the fold and embrace Russian identity. This perspective, that Ukraine has been an integral part of Russia since ancient times, persists among many Russians today. Russia fought approximately 12 bloody wars with the Ottoman Empire over the Caucasus, Balkans, Crimea, and the Black Sea. Ultimately, the Russian Empire defeated the Turks and fully incorporated Ukraine. The 20th century, revolutions, wars, and Soviet era. Following the outbreak of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin granted Soviet Ukraine a degree of separation. After the war, Western Ukraine was seized by a revived Poland. Both Russia and Eastern Ukraine became founding members of the Soviet Union. In 1939, through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany and the Soviet Union partitioned Poland once more, allowing the USSR to reclaim Western Ukraine. Although Ukraine had been allied with Russia for 300 years, it often remained in a subordinate position. Western Ukraine, long outside direct Russian rule, developed strong Roman Catholic communities and Ukrainian linguistic identity. It became the cradle of Ukrainian nationalism. Eastern Ukraine, conquered earlier, was more Russified, with Russian language predominant. During the Soviet period, it served as a heavy industrial heartland, often called the beating heart of Russia, attracting many Russian migrants. In 1932, Ukraine suffered the Holodomor, a catastrophic man-made famine orchestrated under Stalin that killed between 2 and 7.5 million people. Many Ukrainians view this as a deliberate act of genocide by Soviet authorities, fueling lasting resentment. During World War II, known as the Great Patriotic War in Russia, Ukraine became a frozen battlefield and was largely occupied by Nazi Germany. After the war, Ukraine regained its territory as a Soviet republic. In 1954, to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the union with Russia, Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR. At the time, this was largely symbolic, since both were part of the Soviet Union, though it faced opposition from some Crimean residents. Post-Soviet independence and deepening divisions. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine and Russia became independent states. Western Ukraine, with its history of less direct Russian dominance, large numbers of Greek Catholics and Ukrainian speakers, emerged as a stronghold of nationalism. After independence, it pushed strongly toward the West, seeking integration with the European Union and NATO. This drove Ukraine further from Russia. Eastern Ukraine, with deeper historical ties to Russia, Russian-speaking populations,
And heavy industry maintained close relations. Voting patterns in the 2010 presidential election highlighted the divide. Pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych drew strong support from the East, especially Donbas and Crimea, while pro-Western Yulia Tymoshenko dominated the West, particularly Galicia. This political polarization led to repeated power struggles, accelerating national fragmentation and setting the stage for the 2014 crisis. After the 2004 Orange Revolution, pro-Western forces gained power, aggressively pursuing de-Russification policies and halting economic cooperation with Russia. This alienated pro-Russian eastern regions. Ukraine also flirted with NATO membership, which Russia saw as an existential threat, equivalent to an adversary establishing bases on its doorstep. Russia found this unacceptable. In February 2014, pro-Russian President Yanukovych was ousted amid protests, and opposition forces formed a provisional government. A month later, Crimea, long dissatisfied, held a controversial referendum and subsequently joined the Russian Federation. Donbas followed suit, declaring independence amid unrest. Ukraine launched a major military counteroffensive after its May presidential election, labeling it an anti-terrorist operation. Ukraine sought to preserve its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia demanded greater autonomy or special status for eastern Ukraine. With no common ground, the conflict became a protracted war of attrition that continued for years. Conclusion: a fractured brotherhood. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is not merely a modern territorial dispute, but the culmination of centuries of shared yet divergent history. From the glory of Kievan Rus through Mongol invasions, Cossack alliances, imperial partitions, Soviet experiments, and post-Cold War realignments, the two nations have been intertwined in complex ways. Geographic imperatives, cultural differences, religious schisms, and great power politics have all played roles. Understanding this deep historical context is essential to grasping why reconciliation remains so elusive and why the stakes remain extraordinarily high.